Hello everyone. Today, we're diving into a case that shook the quiet town of Griffin, Georgia, back in 2018. It's a story about love, loyalty, and the complexities that can unfold behind closed doors. Stephen Freeman and Mary Katherine Higdon's journey began in their school days, blossoming into a 7-year relationship that seemed like the perfect love story. Stephen, born on January 1, 1995, in Thomaston, Georgia, grew up in the close-knit community of Griffin. Raised in a loving home with his brother, Stephen's parents worked tirelessly to give their children the best foundation in life. Stephen's childhood was as bright as his personality. A cheerful, optimistic soul, he was known for his infectious smile and his love for the great outdoors. Whether it was hiking, camping, hunting, or fishing, nature was Stephen's sanctuary. He also shared a special bond with his mother, one that was filled with mutual admiration. When she pursued her education later in life, Stephen's pride in her accomplishment was profound. He even wrote her a heartfelt letter, calling her the most wonderful woman in the world and thanking her for her unwavering dedication to him and his brother. Stephen had no trouble expressing his emotions, often reminding his loved ones how much they meant to him. That open-hearted nature played a big role when he met Mary Katherine Higdon, a vibrant and adventurous spirit who was a year older than him. Their connection was instant, a love-at-first-sight moment in high school that quickly turned into an inseparable bond. Mary Katherine was just as passionate about the outdoors as Stephen. Camping trips, fishing outings, and wilderness adventures became their shared haven. Confident and skilled, she wasn't intimidated by rugged conditions and even knew her way around firearms, a quality Stephen's friends admired as much as they did her infectious energy and easy charm. Mary Katherine had her own lively history. Raised in a loving family, she was the life of every gathering, entertaining with her singing and dancing. She was creative, full of life, and deeply connected to nature and animals, a perfect match for Stephen's love of the outdoors. If you found this story insightful or thought-provoking, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more content like this, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. We'd love to hear your perspective and continue the conversation. Your support helps us bring more important discussions to light. Thank you for being part of our community. After high school, the couple took their relationship to the next level, moving in together. Stephen took up work at a roofing company, while Mary Katherine became a teaching assistant at a kindergarten. By 2018, Stephen was 23, and Mary Katherine was 24. Their love story, while filled with joy and shared passions, wasn't without its ups and downs. Like many couples, they experienced arguments and even a brief breakup, but their bond always pulled them back together. Over the years, their families grew close. Mary Katherine became a regular at Stephen's family's Sunday dinners, and Stephen's mother cherished her like a daughter. The couple even spent Christmases with both families, blending their worlds into a tight-knit support system. They built their life together on Sunnybrook Drive in Griffin, a place they called home and where they created memories. But as we peel back the layers of this story, we'll uncover the events that turned this idyllic life into something far darker and more tragic than anyone could have imagined. On the night of August 1, 2018, just before 11 p.m. chaos erupted on Sunnybrook Drive. An ambulance and police car raced to the scene after a frantic 911 call from Mary Katherine Higdon. Her voice, trembling with hysteria, conveyed a chilling confession: she had accidentally shot her boyfriend. Sobbing uncontrollably, she struggled to explain what had happened, claiming she had been handing him a gun when it unexpectedly discharged. Through her tears, she insisted she thought the gun wasn't loaded. When emergency personnel entered the couple's apartment, they found a devastating scene. Stephen Freeman lay unresponsive on a mattress in the living room, with Mary Katherine kneeling beside him, her face streaked with tears. She was inconsolable, her cries of, "Please help me, please," echoing through the room. As responders tried to assist, Mary Katherine's panic only deepened. She clung to Stephen, pleading with officers not to take her away, screaming, "I can't lose him." Amid the chaos, Stephen was found to still have a faint pulse. Paramedics acted swiftly, rushing him to the hospital. Meanwhile, Mary Katherine, trembling and in shock, was barely able to form coherent sentences. Over and over, she repeated that it was an accident, that the gun had fired when she handed it to Stephen. Her disbelief was palpable as she stammered, "I wasn't even aiming in that direction. I don't know how it happened." The confusion of the night was underscored by Mary Katherine's desperate cries as she replayed the incident in her mind. "Open the door, help me, please. I didn't mean to," she wailed, as responders tried to manage the scene. It was later revealed that the couple typically kept a firearm by their bed for protection. In fact, they owned around 10 guns, most of them hunting rifles, a testament to their shared outdoor lifestyle. However, on this tragic night, that routine habit would lead to an unimaginable loss. As investigators pieced together the events, the question loomed, was this truly an accident, or was there more to the story than Mary Katherine's tears conveyed? This case would not only test the limits of the forensic evidence but also unravel the deeper complexities of the couple's seemingly picture-perfect relationship. On that fateful night, Mary Katherine claimed she had tried to hand Stephen a Glock 42 when the firearm unexpectedly discharged, striking him in the chest just below the neck. Tragically, despite the paramedics' best efforts, Stephen succumbed to his injuries shortly after arriving at the hospital, passing away minutes before midnight. As police pieced together the events, inconsistencies in Mary Katherine's story began to emerge. The scene in the apartment hinted at turmoil, a kitchen in disarray, with food scattered across the counters and floor, suggesting a heated argument had taken place. Officers also noted the scent of alcohol on Mary Katherine's breath and her intermittent, incoherent mumbling. These details raised suspicions, leading the police to consider that the shooting may not have been an accident. Mary Katherine agreed to go to the station voluntarily for questioning. During the interrogation, she steadfastly maintained that she would never harm Stephen, describing him as her best friend and the love of her life. She explained that guns were a shared passion, something they bonded over, but insisted their firearms were always kept unloaded. Yet, as the conversation progressed, cracks in her narrative became evident. One significant discrepancy caught the investigators' attention. While Mary Katherine initially stated at the scene that she had handed the gun to Stephen, during the interview, she slipped and said, "When I threw the gun to Stephen, it fired." This contradiction, coupled with her extensive experience with firearms, she worked part-time at a local gun shop and prided herself on her knowledge, led officers to question her version of events further. Someone with her expertise would understand the gravity of mishandling a loaded gun, let alone throwing it. Believing they were being misled, the police intensified their tactics. Confronting Mary Katherine, they accused her of lying and demanded the truth. They pointed to the chaotic state of the kitchen as evidence of a quarrel between her and Stephen. When the tone of the interrogation shifted, Mary Katherine broke down in tears. In the midst of her sobbing, she reportedly admitted to pulling the trigger in a moment of anger. However, this alleged confession marked only the beginning of a far more complicated investigation. While the officers initially believed they had swiftly solved the case, the unfolding events would reveal a deeper, more troubling narrative. This wasn't going to be the straightforward resolution they anticipated. Technical issues, further revelations, and the question of intent would cast doubt on everything that came before. On the evening of August 1st, tensions between Mary Katherine and Stephen reached a boiling point. After tracking him down with his friend Thomas, she confronted Stephen from her car. Her anger was palpable as she demanded he return home. Exhausted from the ongoing conflict, Stephen reluctantly agreed, hoping to defuse the situation. He told Thomas he would handle it and reassured his friend he'd call later. Once they arrived back at the apartment, the atmosphere remained tense. Mary Katherine attempted to serve the meal she had prepared, but Stephen seemed uninterested, brushing off her gestures. An argument erupted again, this time escalating into a heated shouting match. The kitchen bore the brunt of their fight, with food and dishes strewn about in the chaos. According to Mary Katherine's later testimony, she retrieved the Glock 42 with the intention of putting it away, as it was left on the bed earlier. However, investigators believed the firearm's appearance was deliberate, aimed at intimidating Stephen. As emotions flared, a tragic sequence of events unfolded. leading to Stephen's fatal gunshot wound. In the days following the shooting, more details emerged, casting further doubt on Mary Katherine's story. While she insisted the discharge was accidental, forensic evidence painted a different picture. The greasy residue found inside the gun matched the roast beef from the kitchen, suggesting the gun had been handled, and potentially loaded, during the evening. This contradicted her claim that the firearm was always kept unloaded. Witnesses from Stephen's circle of friends provided damning insights into their relationship. They described a pattern of volatile behavior, with Mary Katherine frequently resorting to threats and even brandishing firearms during arguments. Stephen's text messages corroborated their accounts, revealing his growing fear and determination to leave the toxic relationship. One text sent just months before his death stood out: "She's not just angry anymore. I see it in her eyes, she's capable of doing something terrible." Despite these alarming revelations, Stephen never reported the incidents to authorities, though police records showed multiple domestic disputes at their residence. The interrogation, which could have been the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, was marred by technical failures. While the footage clearly showed Mary Katherine sobbing and appearing to confess, the audio was compromised by constant noise, rendering her exact words inaudible. Without this critical evidence, the case leaned heavily on circumstantial details. If you found this story insightful or thought-provoking, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more content like this, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. We'd love to hear your perspective and continue the conversation. Your support helps us bring more important discussions to light. Thank you for being part of our community. Prosecutors built their argument around Mary Katherine's motive, erratic behavior, and the forensic evidence. Defense attorneys countered, emphasizing the lack of clear proof and pointing to the relationship's complexity. They painted Mary Katherine as a woman overwhelmed by emotion, insisting the shooting was a tragic accident. Stephen's decision to leave Mary Katherine came too late. He had planned to start fresh, moving out while she was at work to avoid confrontation. But the toxic dynamic they shared ultimately led to his death. Friends and family were left grappling with the devastating loss, haunted by the signs that had gone unheeded. As the trial approached, both sides prepared for a courtroom battle that would dissect the unraveling of a once promising relationship, the events of that fateful night, and whether justice would be served. Would the jury believe Mary Katherine's narrative of an accidental discharge, or would they convict her of a deliberate act of violence fueled by rage? The answers lay in the evidence, and in the shadows of a tumultuous love story turned tragedy. That she had not intended to kill Stephen, but that it was a spur-of-the-moment decision driven by fear and panic. She explained that after the initial argument and the pushing, she felt cornered and out of control. She had never before held the gun in such a way, and in her mind, she was only trying to defend herself, not to end his life. As the trial proceeded, the prosecution worked to highlight the numerous warning signs of escalating violence in their relationship, emphasizing Mary Katherine's history of violent threats towards Stephen. They argued that this was not a case of self-defense, but rather a calculated act of murder committed in anger. They presented evidence from the many calls made to police over the previous year, each one reflecting a pattern of volatile behavior, adding weight to their argument that Mary Katherine had crossed the line from self-defense to deliberate violence. The defense, on the other hand, leaned heavily into the trauma and abuse Mary Katherine had endured throughout the relationship. They painted a picture of a woman trapped in an emotionally abusive and toxic partnership, one in which Stephen's controlling, manipulative behavior had broken her down. By showing the disturbing nature of Stephen's threats and actions toward her, the defense attempted to shift the narrative from one of calculated murder to one of self-preservation in an abusive relationship. Mary Katherine's testimony was emotionally charged, with moments of tears as she recounted the fear she lived in every day, particularly in the weeks leading up to Stephen's death. She spoke about the emotional manipulation, the threats, and the physical intimidation she had endured, and how she felt hopeless and helpless in that moment on August 1st. Her lawyer argued that the combination of her fear and Stephen's aggression in the final moments led her to make a tragic, impulsive decision. The jury deliberated for several days. The case was complex, with conflicting accounts of the relationship and the events of the night in question. The jury had to weigh the credibility of both sides. The prosecutors claimed that the killing was premeditated and fueled by anger, versus the defense's portrayal of a woman acting out of fear in a moment of extreme distress. In the end, the jury found Mary Katherine guilty of manslaughter, not murder. They believed that while she did not act with premeditation, her actions were not entirely justified by the fear and emotional distress she claimed to have experienced. The conviction for manslaughter carried a sentence of 12 years in prison, but with the possibility of parole after 7 years, considering the nature of the crime and her history of abuse. The outcome was met with mixed reactions. Some felt the verdict was fair, acknowledging the complexity of the case and the difficult circumstances surrounding Mary Katherine's emotional state. Others felt that justice had not been fully served, believing that the prosecution's evidence painted her as a clear aggressor. The case sparked debates about the nature of domestic abuse and whether individuals in such relationships can truly be held accountable for their actions under extreme emotional duress. Mary Katherine, in a final statement, maintained that she had not intended to kill Stephen, but that she wished she had done things differently. She expressed regret for the loss of his life, but also for the years she had spent in a relationship that broke her spirit and led her to make a fateful decision she would forever live with. The trial had left her a changed person, and she vowed to work on healing, despite the years of prison ahead. This case served as a stark reminder of the complexities of abusive relationships, and the blurred lines between self-defense and violent action. It also left many questioning the broader societal issues surrounding emotional and physical abuse, and how individuals trapped in such dynamics can find a way out before it's too late. Those types of materials, the prosecutor pointed out, questioning why she had not mentioned this detail in her earlier testimony. Mary Katherine's defense team quickly countered, suggesting that her actions on the day in question were a result of her emotional turmoil, not a premeditated plan to kill Stephen. They argued that the violent internet searches were unrelated and merely a byproduct of her emotional state, exacerbated by the stress and fear she felt living in a toxic and abusive relationship. The prosecution, however, saw the searches as evidence that Mary Katherine had been preoccupied with violent themes, possibly fueling her decision to reach for a gun in a moment of distress. The prosecution theorized that her emotional state, coupled with her exposure to violent imagery, may have contributed to her inability to control her emotions when Stephen escalated the argument. As the case progressed, the defense painted a vivid picture of the depth of control Stephen had over Mary Katherine. Her lawyer introduced more details of the psychological manipulation she had endured, which many in the courtroom found harrowing. It was revealed that Stephen had a history of abusive behavior with previous partners, with similar patterns of controlling and violent tendencies, but no formal complaints were ever made by those women. To counter the prosecution's argument, the defense relied heavily on expert testimony, calling in psychologists who spoke about the effects of long-term emotional and physical abuse on the victim's mental state. These experts explained how victims often internalized the blame for their abuser's actions, and how living in constant fear can alter a person's decision-making process. The psychologist testified that Mary Katherine's failure to report the abuse was not unusual in abusive relationships, where the victim often feels trapped and hopeless, believing they are the cause of the abuse. During this part of the trial, Mary Katherine began to break down emotionally, unable to hold back tears as she recounted the pain she had endured. She spoke about how she felt like a prisoner in her own home, how she had lost all sense of self-worth, and how she believed that she was nothing more than a tool to satisfy Stephen's needs. Her testimony resonated with many in the courtroom, leaving the jury to grapple with the complexities of emotional trauma and self-defense. The defense also brought in a forensic expert who reviewed the gunshot wound and the evidence surrounding the scene. The expert testified that based on the angle of the wound and the position of the gun, it seemed plausible that the shooting could have been the result of a struggle, further supporting Mary Katherine's claim of self-defense. However, the prosecution was not easily swayed. They brought in more witnesses who painted a different picture of Mary Katherine's character. They described her as manipulative and deceitful, pointing to instances where she had reportedly lied about the severity of her relationship with Stephen, including downplaying incidents of violence to friends and family. The prosecutor argued that Mary Katherine had carefully crafted her story to manipulate the court, adding inconsistencies as the trial went on, which suggested a lack of sincerity. In one of the most dramatic moments of the trial, the prosecutor cross-examined Mary Katherine about her ability to access and use the gun. They presented evidence that suggested she had knowledge of how to handle firearms, raising questions about whether she truly acted out of fear or whether she had planned the act of violence. As the trial neared its conclusion, both sides made their closing arguments. The prosecutor emphasized that while Mary Katherine might have been a victim of abuse, that did not justify taking another life. They argued that her decision to shoot Stephen was not a spontaneous act of self-defense, but rather the culmination of months, if not years, of pent-up anger and frustration. They stated that Mary Katherine had every opportunity to leave the relationship but chose not to, and instead, in a moment of anger, she took Stephen's life. The defense, on the other hand, reminded the jury of the years of psychological and physical abuse that Mary Katherine had endured, asking them to consider the toll that abuse had taken on her mental health. They argued that while the decision to shoot Stephen was tragic, it was also understandable, given the circumstances. They urged the jury to take into account the complexity of the situation and the real psychological effects of living in such an abusive relationship. The jury deliberated for several days. The case had sparked intense emotions in the courtroom, with some jurors expressing sympathy for Mary Katherine, while others believed that the evidence pointed to a more deliberate act. They debated the line between self-defense and murder, and the degree to which abuse can justify violent actions in situations of fear and panic. Finally, after an exhaustive deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Mary Katherine was found guilty of second-degree murder. The jury acknowledged that while there was some evidence of abuse, they felt that Mary Katherine had acted with a level of intent that went beyond what could be considered self-defense. However, they also took into account the emotional and psychological toll the relationship had taken on her, and recommended a lighter sentence than the maximum allowed by law. The judge sentenced Mary Katherine to 20 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 12 years. The verdict was met with mixed reactions. Some felt that justice had been served, while others believed that Mary Katherine's actions were a result of her trauma and that the system had failed to truly address the underlying causes of her behavior. In the years following the trial, the case remained a subject of debate, with many questioning the adequacy of the legal system in dealing with cases of domestic violence and abuse. Mary Katherine, for her part, continued to maintain that she had never intended to kill Stephen and that her actions were driven by fear and desperation. As she served her sentence, she sought therapy to deal with the emotional scars of her relationship, and in interviews, she spoke openly about her desire to help others who found themselves in similarly abusive situations. Her case became a landmark example of the challenges faced by victims of abuse who are forced to navigate complex legal systems that often fail to account for the nuances of their trauma. The case prompted discussions about how to better address the needs of those suffering from domestic abuse, and whether self-defense laws should be more flexible to account for the realities of abusive relationships. Though Mary Katherine's story ended tragically, it left a lasting impact on those who followed her case, shedding light on the dark realities of domestic abuse and the difficult choices that victims are often forced to make. And that Mary Katherine had been allowed to walk free despite the undeniable tragedy that had unfolded. Many felt that the jury had been swayed by the emotional testimony and the defense's portrayal of Mary Katherine as a victim of abuse, without fully considering the full scope of evidence that suggested a more complicated narrative. Stephen's family and friends were devastated by the outcome, particularly because they had witnessed firsthand the emotional toll his death had taken on their lives. They felt that while Stephen may have had his flaws, it was Mary Katherine who had taken his life, and that her actions were driven more by anger and frustration than by self-defense. They argued that her previous threats of suicide were part of a larger pattern of manipulation and that she had acted intentionally, even if not with premeditation. For Mary Katherine, the months following her release were filled with mixed emotions. She was free, but the weight of her actions, and the circumstances leading up to them, never truly left her. In interviews and public statements, she expressed relief but also a sense of confusion and guilt. She stated that she was trying to rebuild her life, but the media attention, the public scrutiny, and the continuing pain from the traumatic relationship with Stephen made it difficult for her to move forward. In the years following the trial, Mary Katherine sought therapy to address the emotional scars from the relationship, and she slowly began to speak out about the dangers of staying in abusive situations. She became an advocate for domestic violence victims, particularly those who felt trapped and powerless to escape. While her case had divided opinions, Mary Katherine used her newfound platform to raise awareness of the complexities of abusive relationships and the psychological effects of sustained trauma. Her public advocacy for victims of domestic violence was not without controversy. Many in the community, particularly Stephen's family and friends, accused her of using her status as a convicted killer to gain sympathy and attention. They felt that her advocacy was a way to justify her actions and avoid taking full responsibility for the violence she had committed. To them, her activism felt like a manipulation of public opinion rather than a genuine desire to help others. Despite the criticisms, Mary Katherine continued to work with domestic violence organizations, speaking at events and sharing her story with those who were suffering in silence. She hoped that by being open about her own experiences, others would find the strength to leave abusive relationships before they escalated to violence. Yet, for some, her words carried little weight, as they saw her as someone who had taken a life and was now using the guise of victimhood to avoid accountability. Meanwhile, the case remained a topic of debate within legal circles. Scholars and legal experts analyzed the outcome, with many questioning the adequacy of self-defense laws and the difficulties in prosecuting cases involving domestic abuse. Some argued that the legal system was ill-equipped to handle the complexities of abusive relationships, where the line between victim and perpetrator can often be blurred. Many people, particularly domestic violence survivors, found it difficult to come to a consensus about Mary Katherine's case. Some saw her as a victim who was pushed to the brink, while others believed she had crossed a line that could never be justified. The case became emblematic of the struggles that many face in abusive relationships, the fear, the manipulation, and the emotional toll. It was a tragic reminder that the scars of abuse are not always visible, and the decision to act in self-defense is rarely as simple as it may seem. In the years that followed, Stephen's family remained vocal in their quest for justice. They continued to push for changes in how domestic violence cases were handled, particularly in how evidence was collected and analyzed. They argued that if the investigation into Stephen's death had been more thorough, the truth about what truly transpired that evening might have been more clear. For Mary Katherine, life after the trial was a constant balancing act between her past and present. She struggled with her identity, unsure of whether she was a victim, a survivor, or a perpetrator. The weight of Stephen's death hung over her, and despite her efforts to rebuild, she could never fully escape the haunting memory of that night. As time passed, Mary Katherine remained in the public eye, both praised and vilified, and her story became a cautionary tale for others caught in the web of abusive relationships. The case, though legally concluded, continued to reverberate through the lives of those involved, leaving lasting scars on all who had been touched by it. In the end, the tragic story of Mary Katherine and Stephen raised more questions than answers. It exposed the dangers of staying silent in the face of abuse and highlighted the need for greater support systems for those in abusive relationships. Yet it also demonstrated the complexities of the legal system in dealing with cases where the line between self-defense and murder is often indistinct. The case was a painful reminder of the complexities of the human heart, the blurred lines between right and wrong, and the devastation that can be wrought by a single moment of violence. And for reflecting on the difficult and painful issues surrounding domestic violence. Stephen's mother, in particular, felt a deep responsibility to honor her son's memory by continuing the fight against domestic violence. While she was heartbroken by the loss of her son, she also believed that his story could be a catalyst for change. She tirelessly campaigned for greater awareness of the signs of abuse, the need for early intervention, and the importance of providing support for both victims and perpetrators of violence. Her efforts were focused not only on helping victims of domestic violence but also on addressing the broader issue of gender-based violence. She often spoke about how domestic abuse affects both men and women, though it is often less acknowledged when men are the victims. Her advocacy was aimed at encouraging society to break free from traditional stereotypes about domestic violence, where men are seen only as perpetrators, and women as victims. If you found this story insightful or thought-provoking, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more content like this, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. We'd love to hear your perspective and continue the conversation. Your support helps us bring more important discussions to light. Thank you for being part of our community. In her speeches, Stephen's mother would often remind her audience that the pain of loss was something that transcended gender. She spoke from the heart, sharing her son's story, but she also made it clear that domestic violence can take many forms. Whether it's physical, emotional, or psychological, the scars are real, and they affect families, communities, and entire societies. Her message was that no one should be afraid to seek help and that society must create safe spaces for all victims, no matter their gender. While Mary Katherine's case remained a source of pain for Stephen's family, they knew that speaking out could help others. They worked with various organizations to promote healthy relationship practices and mental health resources for those trapped in abusive situations. They also pushed for legal reforms that would ensure that all victims of domestic violence, regardless of gender, would be treated with the dignity and respect they deserved. Through these efforts, Stephen's mother became a leading figure in the movement to address domestic violence from a more inclusive perspective. She often collaborated with groups that provided shelter, counseling, and legal support to those suffering from domestic abuse. Her passion for helping others grew, fueled by the pain of losing her son, but also by a desire to prevent other families from experiencing the same tragedy. Meanwhile, Mary Katherine's path was one of slow but consistent self-exploration and healing. Although the acquittal allowed her to walk free, it did not erase the complex emotions she struggled with. The remorse she felt over Stephen's death weighed heavily on her, as did the guilt of how their relationship had ended. She often found herself revisiting the moments leading up to that night, questioning what could have been done differently, what signs she had missed, and whether there was any way she could have avoided the tragic outcome. Her therapy sessions became a key part of her healing process. She worked hard to address the trauma from her past, particularly the abuse she claimed to have suffered at Stephen's hands. Yet, there was also a deep, internal conflict within her. She wanted to move forward, but the memories of the violence, her own and that of Stephen's, haunted her. The relationship they had shared was toxic, and despite her claims of wanting to escape, she found herself trapped in a cycle of emotional and psychological torment. In therapy, she began to confront these contradictions, trying to understand how someone could be both a victim and a perpetrator of violence. Despite her public advocacy, some still questioned her sincerity. Many who had followed her story closely remained skeptical, believing that she was using her victimhood as a shield to avoid facing the true consequences of her actions. But Mary Katherine was determined to continue her journey of self-discovery. She spoke to counselors and advocates for domestic violence victims, trying to find a balance between owning her actions and understanding her past. Over time, Mary Katherine began to speak more openly about her experiences, focusing not just on the abuse but also on the complexities of love and control in relationships. She talked about the cycle of violence she had endured, and how difficult it was to escape from a relationship where both partners were struggling with their own demons. Her goal was not to justify her actions but to share the painful truth about how complicated these situations could become. As Mary Katherine worked to rebuild her life, she made efforts to reconnect with her family, seeking forgiveness and understanding. The road to reconciliation was long and difficult. Her family, while still supportive in some ways, struggled with the deep emotional wounds left by the trial and the events leading up to Stephen's death. They were torn between their love for her and their anger over what had happened. For Stephen's family, the years following his death were marked by grief and a continued fight for justice. Although the legal system had cleared Mary Katherine of any wrongdoing, they believed that Stephen's death had been preventable. They saw her actions as a deliberate and calculated response to a broken relationship. They maintained that there had been enough warning signs, enough history of manipulation and violence, to suggest that Mary Katherine had taken matters into her own hands out of frustration, not fear. This divide between the families, one looking for justice for a lost loved one and the other seeking redemption for someone trying to rebuild her life, remained a central theme in the ongoing narrative surrounding the case. Both sides continued to struggle with the fallout of that tragic night, each processing their grief, anger, and frustration in their own way. In a final act of defiance, Stephen's mother pushed forward with her mission, aiming to make sure that her son's death was not in vain. She pushed for public policy reforms to address domestic violence in more nuanced ways, ways that recognized that both men and women could be victims of violence, and that both needed to be supported in their recovery. Her message was clear: no one should suffer in silence. No one should feel trapped in an abusive situation without hope. And above all, no one should ever feel as if they have no choice but to resort to violence as a solution to their pain. If you found this story insightful or thought-provoking, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to our channel for more content like this, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts. We'd love to hear your perspective and continue the conversation. Your support helps us bring more important discussions to light. Thank you for being part of our community. As for Mary Katherine, the path ahead remained uncertain. She was determined to heal, but the weight of her past, her trauma, and the memories of what had happened would always be with her. The case, her role in it, and the public's perception of her would likely continue to shape her life in ways she could not fully anticipate. However, in her own way, she hoped that her advocacy could help others, people who felt as lost and alone as she had once felt. She hoped that one day, she could make peace with herself, and perhaps help others do the same. Both stories, Stephen's tragic death and Mary Katherine's complex journey of self-realization, would continue to serve as a somber reminder of the complexities of domestic violence and the fine line between victim and perpetrator. For those involved, the scars remained, even if justice had been served in one form or another.